It was Christmas in the trenches, where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were still, no Christmas song was sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day. They are brave and glorious lads, so far away. I was lying with my messmates on the cold and rocky ground, when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says I, "Now listen up, me boys," each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. "He's singing bloody well, you know," my partner says to me. Soon, one by one, each German voice joined it in harmony. The cannons rested silent. The gas cloud rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. This is from the beginning of John McCutcheon's Christmas in the Trenches. This song describes an event from World War I, commonly referred to as the Christmas Truce. We've seen it depicted most recently in a commercial for a UK supermarket chain. The Christmas Truce was a real event. It took place December 24th of 1914, about 5 months after the start of World War I. It's said to have started on the Western Front in Belgium, when the Germans started singing Silent Night from their trenches, which was originally a German song, but very recognizable to the Allies across no man's land, a 250-yard expanse between the opposing trenches. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The serene melody, an illustration of the newly born infant Savior sleeping in heavenly peace, contrasts greatly with the no man's land that it drifted over. Pictures of no man's land show a haunting expanse of abandoned equipment and barbed wire. It was pockmarked with shell holes from artillery fire that were filled with water and littered with bodies of men that were shot as they crawled through the mud to obtain information from their enemy. But what started in Belgium happened up and down the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides sang in their native tongue Christmas carols that were recognizable by both Central and Allied troops. Graham Williams of the 5th London Rifle Brigade recounted, "First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up, 'O come, all ye faithful,' the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words, 'Ades Fidelis,' and I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war." As soldiers crept out of their trenches, they began to see German soldiers carrying Christmas trees and realized that this was not a trick. They met on no man's land, exchanging things like chocolate, brandy, and tobacco, and even playing soccer. They also took time to bury their dead, but strangely enough, it wasn't in a bitter manner. As they picked up their comrades, soldiers they called an enemy moments ago were helping with the burial. As well, Soldiers were surprised to meet enemy soldiers that could speak their own languages. Each soldier saw that his enemy counterpart didn't want to be there as much as he didn't want to be there. Soldiers on both sides saw the others as fathers and sons, just as they were. Now, this truce was spontaneous. It happened between the grunts in the trenches and against the desires of the commanding officers. As some soldiers commented, if this continued, it might be the end of the whole war. But of course, the commanders would eventually threaten to kill anyone participating in the truce and continue that threat every year following. The next year, a few smaller examples would break out, but it wouldn't follow the remaining years of the war, and nothing to the extent of the first truce in 1914. Ron Paul wrote of the truce in his book, Swords into Plowshares, and really hits on a point that I think more Christians should consider when talking about war, then and now. He says, "This story of that most unusual Christmas Eve demonstrates the age-old conflict between man's natural, peaceful inclinations and politicians' obsession with war. That Christmas Eve's spontaneous cessation of fighting on the front lines was remarkable in that it was such a rare event. It just didn't make sense to the young men of the Christian nations that they should spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day slaughtering each other. At quite a young age, when I first became aware of what Christianity was teaching, a thought crossed my mind. 2 Christian nations should never have to go to war. I later learned that this was not the case historically, much to my disappointment. In World War I, people of Christian nations were fighting and killing each other, contradicting the message of peace that Christ taught." In another part of the song, A Christmas Truce, John McCutcheon says, "Soon daylight stole upon us, and France was France once more. With sad farewells, we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that lived that wondrous night, whose family have I fixed within my sights? It was Christmas in the trenches, where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warmed, as songs of peace were sung. For the walls they'd kept between us, to exact the work of war, had been crumbled and were gone forevermore." Another part of Ron Paul's comments on the Christmas truce, he said, "The dramatic and spontaneous truce that Christmas Eve spawned by the wishes of young German, British, French, and Belgian soldiers reveals the true nature of most human beings forced into wars that have no meaning. This is why warfare, especially in the decades following World War I, involved government conditioning of soldiers to kill their fellow human beings. The enemy had to be dehumanized, and epithets were used to help, Krauts, Japs, Gooks, etc., lest people's natural instincts prevail. Without conditioning to kill, some soldiers, especially draftees, were found shooting above the target to avoid killing the enemy. Since World War II, we've seen a concerted U.S. military effort to eliminate any natural instincts against killing other than for true defense of one's homeland. This effort has become more necessary as our wars have become more offensive in nature. This most unusual event on that particular Christmas Eve on the front lines of a brutal war was detested by the politicians and the military leaders who believed the truce had to be stopped. Peace could not be permitted to break out among the troops who were supposed to kill and die in a war brought about by politicians hundreds of miles away. The Christmas Truce is a beautiful yet sad event. It's beautiful as it shows what can be accomplished if the riflemen just stop fighting. And it seems to confirm John Lennon's words, "War is over if you want it." Stanley Weintraub wrote of a British captain that was adverse to the truce in his book Silent Night, The Remarkable Christmas Truce of 1914. When reflecting on the larger implications of the ceasefire, he wrote, "It is interesting to visualize the close of a campaign owing to the opposing armies, neither of them defeated, having become too friendly to continue the fight." But the truce is also very sad because we know it doesn't last, and the war would continue to kill about 10 million soldiers and about 7 million civilians. Weintraub also wrote in his book of the truce, "On both sides in 1915, there would be more dead on any single day than yards gained in the entire year. And there would be nearly 4 more years of attrition, not to determine who was right, but who was left." The truce teaches us a lot of things. And one we need to remember is in the final lines of the song Christmas in the Trenches. "Each Christmas come since World War I have learned its lessons well, that the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, and on each end of the rifle, we're the same." You've been listening to episode 23 of the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit about the Christmas Truce. It's something that means a lot to me every year, and there's no shortage of information out there. I'll have some links in the show notes to books and other sources for more information, more in-depth accounts of the events up and down the Western Front during the Christmas Truce. And before we leave, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider a couple of things. One, hitting the subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using. You won't miss any future episodes, and it'll help us grow the show. If you're not sure where to subscribe to us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. And one other thing, please consider supporting us with a monthly donation through Patreon. Your donations will help us grow the show, will help pay for the website and the other costs involved in getting this show out to you. So again, thank you. And I'll have links to the show notes to other books and other resources for you to check out on the Christmas Truce. So until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ, and have a Merry Christmas.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.